The Missouri River is a little over 2,500 miles long. It's the second longest river in the North American continent, and it is the largest river, the longest river in the United States. It is at its widest point over 13 miles across. And I think that's really interesting because if you look back in 1804, I know that's a long time ago, Thomas Jefferson was president, and he commissioned this little group that you might have heard of, the Lewis and Clark expedition, to kind of go, and they were trying to find a passageway out west, but specifically one of their tasks was to see if they could find the source of the Missouri River. At that point, it was so long and nobody had ever actually found the end of it. They called it the Endless River at that time because they thought, this thing just goes on forever. So as they were searching for that, while they weren't successful in all of their endeavors, in this one they were. And on August 12, 1805, they found the headwaters to the Missouri River. And in Lewis's journal, he wrote this, that Private Hugh McNeil stood exultingly with one foot on each side of this little rivulet and thanked God that he had lived to bestride the mighty and heretofore deemed endless Missouri River. Now, I think that's interesting that, again, at its widest point, 13 miles across, that if you were to stand there and just see this little trickle coming out, you would have no idea that if you followed it for 2,000 miles, you would still have to go another 500 miles before you're even getting close to the end, from the mountains of Montana and Idaho, through the Rockies, over the Continental Divide, to the lowlands of St. Louis, Missouri, where it is emptied into the Mississippi River. And yet, in 1805, a young man stood with one foot on either side of this mighty river. That's a little bit like what we're going to read in this story today. What seemed like it was insignificant, what seemed like it wasn't enough, what seemed like it had no way of ever becoming enough to satisfy the entirety of this group of people, just this little tiny beginning, would be expanded and expanded, and when we're put into the hands of Christ, would turn out to be a feast that would feed 5,000 people and still have much left over. See, often whenever we start with small beginnings, we have this kind of scarcity mentality, right? Whenever we start with small beginnings, maybe we don't have a lot of money and we're like, I have $5, what could that do for the kingdom? I only have 5 minutes, how could I actually leverage that for Bible study or prayer? Like, I might as well not even try, it's only 5 minutes. I only have just this little tiny pool of resources. How could that ever actually amount to any impact in this world around me? And whenever we have this mindset, we miss what God has done with the rivers. That they start off small, where you can stand with one foot on either side of them, and mile after mile after mile, day after day after day, they expand and they become something that is impressive and vital to the land around them. And in the same way, our little scarce resources that we have, the things that we're like, God, how could you use me? How could you use these things that I have? I don't have a lot. I have this tiny house. I have this little thing. I have not much money. I have not much time. I have not much wisdom. I have not much experience. Whatever it is that we discount in our lives, we start off with this little pool, and often our instinct is not to say, Jesus, take this and do something with it, but nothing can be done with this. Why even try? Have you ever felt like that? Like, what I have, it's not even that much. Why should I try? I've only got 5 minutes, so really, what's 5 minutes in the Word of God? What's 5 minutes of prayer time? Like, is that actually going to have an impact on my life? So I'm just not going to do it instead. I'll just scroll for 5 minutes on Instagram instead, because that's probably going to be more beneficial for me, right? Whenever we start off with this little pool of resources. But Jesus here in this story is going to take what seems laughable among so many, a few loaves and some tiny fish. His disciples are like, what, Would you go have us to spend basically a year's wages to go and buy bread for these people, and they couldn't even hardly have a little mouthful even if we did? But with just what they had, Jesus turned it into a miracle. And today as we read, I want you to think about your life, and maybe those areas of your life that you think, God could never really do anything with this. It's not much. Again, it's like, I've got one night a week that I could actually do something with, and what could God do with that in my community? I've got $10 a month that I could give to the work of the Lord, and what could God possibly do with that would be of any impact? I've got 10 minutes a day, and what could God possibly do with that would be of any impact? And yet, here in this story, we're going to read that what seemed insignificant to the disciples was more than enough when put into the hands of Jesus. So I am going to start reading here. We are in the book of Mark, and we're starting at verse number 30 again. This is now the culmination of where we started 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, we read about Jesus sending out the 12 disciples all among the region of Galilee, and they were out around the cities and the towns and the villages of Nazareth, preaching the word of the Lord. Last week we read about the death of John the Baptist, but now we're coming back to the disciples have gone out. They have seen mighty works done in the name of Jesus, and now they're coming back into Jesus to give him the report of what happened. So we start in chapter 6, verse number 30. The apostles returned to Jesus, and they told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. So I want to stop right there as we have read through this. And the disciples here, they give the report to Jesus of the work that they had done. But obviously, even as they give the report to Jesus, their work isn't over, right? Because they've been spreading the word of God. They have seen miracles happen in Jesus' name. And so these crowds that have been following Jesus are also following his disciples. They are wanting healing. They are wanting to see these miracles. They are excited. So the crowds are pushing it around them, and they haven't even had time to eat. It said that they were so busy that they didn't even have time to eat. Do you guys ever do that? Like, my wife is the worst at this. I'm calling her out right now. I'm sorry. But you get so busy, right? You just go, and I'm like, "Hey, did you eat today?" No? Right? You ever do that? Like, you just get so busy with stuff, and you have so much stuff on your plate. Your mind is so preoccupied that you're like, "I have not eaten anything today." And that's where the disciples were. They had done that. They were doing ministry. They were so actively involved. They were preaching and teaching the word of God. They were touching and praying for the sick and those who were infirm. They were doing really good things, and they were so busy that they didn't even eat. Does that resonate at all with you in your life? Do you ever feel that busy? Do you ever feel that rushed in all the things that you do? On Sunday nights, we've just started last week a new study that's called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. And that oftentimes our lives just become so full of stuff, right? And we feel like we're not even walking from one thing to the next thing, we're sprinting. And then, like, whenever we get done with that thing, we're already 10 minutes late on the other thing that we were supposed to be doing, right? And it's just this continual, like, rushing and rushing and rushing, and there's no room and there's no margin in our lives. And Jesus sees that this is kind of the place the disciples are in. They've been doing good things. They've been preaching the word of Jesus. All of these things are good, but, man, they've run themselves ragged. They're not even eating. They need rest. So we read in verse number 32 that, in verse number 31, and he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while." So this was Jesus' call now to the disciples. You've done good work. You're doing good things. All of these things need to be done, but you need rest. You need rest. You need to withdraw to a desolate place, to a place that's out away from everything else, and just take a breath. That's an exciting call. And for some of us, that's a really difficult call. and now since I called my wife out, she would call me out in this and just say that I am really bad at resting. Like, I am not good at that. I am very much like, as soon as my feet hit the ground, like there's stuff to do, right? Like it's the day, we got to do all these different things and run and run and run. And sometimes the hardest thing for me to do is just to sit down and take a breath. And Jesus calls us sometimes to withdraw, to rest, to go to a desolate place. One of the things that helped me in this area in my life is thinking about all the different ways that we can know God, right? Like if we look all throughout Scripture, there's so many different ways that God reveals himself. He reveals himself as a God of love and a God of justice, a God of mercy, all of these different ways that we want to know him, right? We want to see all of these aspects of God. And one of the ways that God is revealed is he's the God that gives Sabbath. He's a God who gives rest. And if we're not careful, we can miss that aspect of God. We can completely miss knowing God in the way of the God who gives rest because we're so busy. Because we fill our lives so much, because we have this frenetic pace that's from one thing to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing, and we are just constantly in motion. And for some of us, I know for me sometimes, this call of Jesus is good and difficult. Withdraw to a desolate place and rest. So maybe that's a place that you're at in your life today. I don't know, I know we're all in different seasons, in different areas, but maybe you've just been running, sprinting through the last several weeks, and you need this call from Christ today. Withdraw. Rest. Jesus said, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. He said, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And for some of you today, that's good news. You need to hear that there is rest for you. In the midst of a crazy life, in the midst of all the things that you have to do, Christ this morning offers you rest. So maybe you need that today. But we continue to read through this chapter. And they went away in the boat, this is verse number 32, to a desolate place by themselves. Now, many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all of the towns, and they got there ahead of them. And when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like a sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. So again, now we see here that they have got in the boat. Jesus says, let's withdraw. You guys have done good ministry. You have done good work. You need some rest. So they get on the boat and they go. And all these people now see Jesus and his disciples get in the boat. And they just start like sprinting, right? Like they're just like running across the shoreline. I don't know if you've ever been, like boats are pretty quick, right? And they're having to go the long way around. Like the boat is just taking the direct course. So, I mean, these guys are like running, like picking up, they're wearing togas and stuff. They're picking up, and like running barefoot all the way trying to catch up with this boat. And it says apparently they did a pretty good job of it because they're like yelling all around, like Jesus and them, they're going over here. And so all of these people come out from these towns just running as fast as they can. It says, and they beat them to the other side of the lake. And they get there before them. And you can just imagine this sweaty crowd, right? Because now they've run, they're like, I'm running with Oliver in the mornings now. It's been a long time since I've run, and I can tell you, I'm like mile 2. I'm, like, I don't know what's going on. But like the sweaty crowd standing out there, right? And Jesus is getting off the boat with his disciples, and they're tired. They've done good ministry, but they're seeing all these guys huffing and puffing, these families standing out there, these people who are waiting for the Messiah, these people who have, Jesus has mentioned, they've been oppressed by the religious leaders, and they're looking for something that's real, and they're looking for something that's true, and they're waiting for God to redeem Israel, and they're standing there sweaty and puffing, and Jesus gets off the boat, he looks at them, and he has compassion on them. Because he sees their fervor. They're running after him. They're literally sprinting around this lake because they're looking for something to believe in. They're looking for someone to follow. They're looking for the person who's going to come and who's going to set them on the right path. They've listened to the religious leaders, but as we've heard, they had no authority. They were heaping heavy burdens on the people, but they were doing nothing to help them live the lives that they were called to live by God. And so they said, just figure it out. And whenever Jesus gets off the boat and he sees these people who are searching and longing that they might know what truth is, it says he has compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. I think this is how Jesus looks at the world around us today. There are people who are searching for what is true. There are people who are looking to see something that will give them meaning and purpose to their lives. There are people who are desperate because they have maybe even been to some churches that have heaped heavy burdens on them and told them that you're not good enough, you need to do all of these things, and if you don't do them, then you're not right. They have been to a world that tells them, hey, actually, you're the leader of your own destiny. Like, whatever you say, that's right. And I don't know about you, but I say a lot of wrong things all the time, right? If I'm the one who's in charge of my life, I'm in trouble. And people are told in the world, you're the arbiter of your own destiny. You figure out what you want to do. It's whatever makes you happy. It's whatever fulfills you the most. You just go out there and figure it out. And that is a crushing weight to be under. That you're the one who's supposed to decide what's right and wrong and what your own destiny and what you're supposed to be doing. We can't stand up underneath that. And I think if Jesus saw our world today with all of the different ideologies that have been foisted upon us, with all of the different years and years of pseudo-Christianity and of nominal Christianity and of political Christianity and of all these different things saying, this is really what matters in life. And if Jesus were to see them, I think he would see them very much as the same group of first century Jewish people who had been crushed under this heavy weight and were looking for the truth. I think that's the world that we walk into every day. A world that has been crushed under a heavy weight and needs to know the truth and the freedom of Christ. And so he sees them and he says that they are like sheep without a shepherd. And he has compassion on them. And it says, and he began to teach them many things. I love that. I love this picture of Jesus that, again, as he's been busy, as he's now trying to withdraw, but he sees these desperate people, these people who need the gospel, these people who need something to believe in and need someone to follow, that he ministers to them. In our lives, whether we know it or not, I think we're surrounded by these kind of people. We're surrounded by these kind of people that Jesus is now surrounded with, people who need to hear the gospel, people who are crushed under the burden of this world that we live in, people who have been trying to do life on their own, people who have been told by many different sources throughout their life, this is what you need to do, this is what you need to do, this is what they need to do, and never actually experience the freedom that comes from knowing and following Christ. And they feel crushed. And we run into these people every day. And even if it's that 5-minute margin that we have, or that 10-minute margin, or that, hey, I've got $10, I'm going to take somebody out to lunch and have a conversation with them. Those things can be powerful in their lives. Because again, every day, even here in Oklahoma City, the buckle on the Bible belt, right, the big shiny one, like, there are people who are desperately in need of the message of Christ. So as we continue now, we see probably the most well-known part of this story as this miracle is performed. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, this is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. So send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. But he answered them, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it them to eat? So now Jesus has taught them many things. They're surrounded by him. They're captivated and enthralled. I can only imagine just like actually getting to hear Jesus speak like face to face. Like that would be enthralling, right? You're just like, what's he going to say next, right? You're just captivated by this. And so Jesus obviously had this way where he's captivating this audience and they are looking to him. And it has now gone from morning to midday to now close to evening. The sun is going down. They are in the middle of a desolate, deserted place. And the disciples come to Jesus and they say, hey, listen, these people probably need to go eat something. So let's dismiss them. right? Let's send them away so that they can go find something to eat in the surrounding towns and villages. This is a very understandable request that the disciples are making, right? They're like, listen, Jesus, you brought us over here because we need some rest, right? So we're coming over here to rest. We've done some more ministry. Let's send them away. Like, we don't have the necessary resources to be able to feed these people. So the most compassionate thing we can do is just tell them, go out, fend for yourselves, go and take care of it, and then maybe come back tomorrow. Like, we understand that, right? Like, we all have limited resources. We all only have so much in the tank. We all only have so many dollars in the bank. So there's only so many things that we can do. And sometimes we run into these situations and it's like, well, what could I actually do for that person? What could my limited resources actually do to help that specific person or that group or this world that I live in? And Jesus instead flips the table a little bit on the disciples and says, no, don't send them away. You give them something to eat. And you kind of sense this little like bit of panic in the disciples of like, do you want us to go buy bread? Like, do you want us to go buy 200 denarii worth of bread? Like, that's a lot of bread. Like, that's kind of all the money that we have right now, probably. That's why did they choose the 200 denarii? Well, probably because they were like, well, that's like probably all we could scrape together, 200 denarii worth of bread, and it's not enough. And also, we read in the account in the book of Matthew that they're like, where would we even go to buy bread? Like, we're in the middle of the desert. It's a deserted place. We're in the middle of nowhere. Where could we even go to buy bread for all of these people? So we don't have the money to buy enough bread for them, Jesus. And even if we had the money, there's no place that we could go to buy bread. Like, we can't just go to Ted's and be like, hey, give me a setup. Like, that's awesome, right? We can't go and do that. There's no place to go to get what we need. So we don't have the money. We don't have the resources. What do you want us to do, Jesus? And Jesus just asked them a very simple question. He doesn't berate them. He doesn't say, oh, well, actually, you're right. Never mind. That's kind of a horrible idea. So just send them away. He doesn't be like, Instead, he just asks a simple question. He says, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. He says, what do you have? What do we have on hand? What is available to us? And just give it to me. So they go out and they start to search around and try to figure out what they have. And they come back with a report that we have 5 loaves and 2 fish. And again, this is like the beginning of the Missouri River, right? We've got 5 loaves and we've got 2 fish. Like, we said that we couldn't feed all these people with 200 denarii worth of bread. This is like half a denarii worth of bread and fish. Like, this is not very much, Jesus. That's all we've got. And in some ways, you kind of see him like presenting it of like, see, this is the situation that we're in, Jesus. Like, we've only got 5 loaves. We've only got 2 fish. So there's not really anything that we can do. And then this is what we see Jesus do. He says, then he commanded them all to sit down on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and he said a blessing, and he broke the loaves and he gave them to the disciples and to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces, and those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. So what we see is that the disciples come and they give Jesus this report. We've got 5 loaves, we've got 2 fish, that's it. And Jesus simply says, okay, great. Have everybody sit down. And you got to imagine that as they're sitting down, I wondered as I was reading this passage, like, why did they sit down in groups of hundreds and 50s? And I'm sure that's so that they could keep count, right? Like, okay, so how many people are actually here? So like, okay, well, there's 50 here, there's 100 here, there's 50 here, there's 100 here. So they had a pretty good count. So whenever they said, like, there's 5,000 men, it's because they had sat them down in these groups of people, right? So they knew how many were there. And you have to imagine that they're like, okay, 5 loaves, 2 fish, and they sit the first group of 50 people down, and they're like, we're in trouble. And they set the next group of 100 people down, they're like, okay, Right? Like, what are we going to do? And they set the next group of 50 down. And they set the next group of 100 down. And they set the next group of 50 down. All the way up until there's 5,000 men plus women and children sitting out on the grass. And they look at probably a meal that would fill up this little space of some loaves and some fish. And they think that's impossible. That's impossible. What could we possibly do with this among so many people? And yet, Jesus simply looked up to the Father and he gave thanks and he began distributing. And just like that head tributary of the Missouri, as it continued to flow, it got wider and wider and wider, and the bread kept going and going and going, and the fish kept going and going and going, and 5,000 men later, plus women and children, everybody had eaten, and not just eaten a mouthful and not just eaten a little, but they ate and they were satisfied from that little stockpile that they had that day. And I wonder in our world what we could do with the resources that God has given to us, if we would stop trying to explain away all of the reasons why we can't do things for the Lord. Those little pool of resources that we have, if we were to say, God, I know it's not much, but I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to put it in the hands of Jesus, and I'm going to believe that he's going to do something. Because whenever those 5 loaves and these 2 fish were put into the hands of Jesus, it fed multitudes. And not just fed them, but satisfied their hunger. And not just that, but then at the end, just as the cherry on top, I mean, you almost see this as Jesus just like showing off just a little bit, right? Like at the end, because then they picked up 12 baskets full. Like, hey, now you guys have lunch for tomorrow too. Every one of you disciples, now you don't have to worry about tomorrow's lunch either. I've got that covered too. All from this seemingly tiny stockpile of resources. And so now I have to ask you, in what area of your life do you think you have insignificant resources, insufficient funds, unusable talents that you've just written off for God to be able to use? That whenever you look at them, you're just like, God can't use that. So I might not even try. Might as well not even attempt to give that to the Lord, because what could he possibly do with it anyways? Could you imagine if the same thing had been done here? How many loaves are there? There's no loaves. Could Jesus still have done something? Absolutely. But would they have missed out on seeing what God could have done with those tiny little resources? Yeah, I mean, Jesus could have done whatever. Like, God rained manna from heaven for 40 years. Like, if he wanted to, he could have just been like, manna, right, coming down, manna rain. It would have been awesome. Like, he could have done that if that's what he wanted to do. But instead, what he chose to do was take what seemed like nothing and turn it into more than enough. What seemed like lack and turn it into abundance. And that's what God wants to do in our lives too. That whenever we take the small things that we think, how could we use this? Because I feel that way sometimes. As a church plant, we don't have a lot of people here. And in talking sometimes, especially I've been talking over the last couple of weeks with several larger churches as we get ready to do this ministry and this outreach to the Afghan refugees and to these kids. And it's easy to be like, guys, so when you ask us what our budget is, it's $0. Okay, like we don't have money. Like you ask us, like, hey, we're gonna bring by 50 people. How many of you guys gonna bring? Like, we don't even have 50 people, right? Like it seems sometimes so insignificant. Of like, how could God possibly use this? But in the midst of that, we have to believe that, hey, whatever we have, as small and seemingly minor as it might be, if we present it to the Lord, He can use that for His glory. He can use that to draw people to Himself. He can use that just like this to satisfy those who are hungry. I believe that's true of us as a church. And so even as we seek to do just the small things that we can as we're getting started, that God can use that for His glory. Even though it might not seem like it, even though it might seem like, yeah, but there's churches of 5,000 people and 8,000 people and whatever people that could do all this ministry so much better. But couldn't God get so much glory from doing it from just this little group? And in the same way, yes, there's millionaires and billionaires in this world, and God could touch their hearts and reach into their pocketbooks to pull out the billions of dollars to reach around the world and to see people saved and to see the lost and unreached people groups, the billions of people who are out there who don't know him. He could reach out and he could touch just one billionaire and see it happen. But he also receives massive glory whenever he touches thousands of people with just a look. Thousands of people who seem like they have insignificant resources, insufficient funds, the inability to do anything that would be considered great, and yet God takes those things, and when we put them in his hands, he multiplies them, and we see great things happen. So what area of your life have you convinced yourself is so small, is so insignificant, that God can't use it to reach people? What talent in your life you're like, yeah, but it's not very good. Yeah, but I don't have a lot of experience. Yeah, but I don't have a lot of time. What area of your life are you withholding from God because you just think it's not really important anyways? And the second part of that question is, what could happen if we trusted God just a little bit? To say, I'm going to give you that 5 minutes that I think is insignificant. Lord, show me what you would do. I'm going to give you that small amount of money that I think is insignificant. Lord, show me what you could do with it. I'm going to give you that one night a week that I think, how could I possibly reach my friends and neighbors or my family with just one night a week? But I'm going to give it to you. And I'm going to see what you do with it. I'm going to give you that 5 minutes in the morning that I have with my kids so that I can do a family devotional, even though 5 minutes seems like nothing whenever they're going to go out into the world and they're going to have all of these different encounters with people, and 5 minutes just doesn't seem like a lot, but I'm going to give it to you. My lunch break at work, I'm going to give it to you so that I can reach out to those coworkers around me. Those times that I have that I'm just wasting time and I just think, well, it's not really that big of a deal. My time is not that valuable. I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to see, Lord, what you might do with it. And if this account here in the book of Mark is any indication, he will do more with it than we could ever imagine. He will do more with it than we could ever imagine. And then just at the end, he'll probably sprinkle just a little bit of that cherry on top. Just like with the disciples, right? Like, hey, and by the way, here's lunch for tomorrow. I think that each one of us, if we could trust God enough to give him what we have, without the qualification of, it's not good enough, it's not big enough, it's not fancy enough, it's not polished enough. If we could trust God just enough to say, I'm going to give you what I have, not because of anything to do with my gift, not because of anything to do with the bread. Might not have even been that good of bread. We don't know. We just know it was a loaf of bread. Like, not because of anything to do with the fish. What kind of fish were they? We don't know. Probably wasn't tuna, Probably wasn't salmon, probably some kind of mackerel, I don't know, something going, like, we don't know what kind of fish, we don't know what kind of bread, but what we do know is what Jesus did with it. And that's the point. The point isn't, I only have 5 minutes. The point is that Jesus can take whatever I give him, and he can use it to reach the world. That Jesus can take whatever I have, as small and insignificant as it seems, and it's not because of what I'm giving, it's because of who he is, that it will be multiplied. It's not because of the quality of the gift that I have available, it's because of the amazing ability of the Christ that I serve, that it will go out and it will work in our world. And so every one of us, I can say pretty unequivocally, have those things in our lives that we withhold from God, not because we're attempting to hoard, not because we don't think he's good enough or that he deserves them, but we withhold them from God because we don't think they're good enough for him. We withhold them from God because we really don't think that it could come and turn into anything. We don't serve because we don't think that we're good enough servants. We don't give because we think that the gift isn't good enough. We don't go because we think, what could we possibly do if we were to give our time? But if we were to unleash those things, if we were to say, God, I'm going to put them in your hands. And whatever the gift is, whatever kind of fish it is, whatever kind of bread it is, makes no difference on your ability to provide. I think we would see many things happen. I think we would have many gospel conversations whenever we would take that 5 minutes or that 30-minute lunch break, and we would dedicate it to the Lord and say, would you use this and would you multiply it? So I just want us to ask ourselves that question. Just that one question. What am I withholding from God because I don't think it's good enough? What area of my life am I like, I don't have enough time, so why would I give him that 5 minutes? I don't have enough resources, so why would I give him what I do have? It's not good enough. If we were to just surrender those things to the Lord, what could he do? Last illustration, and then I just want to close this in prayers. I think sometimes we lose the wonder of life a little bit as we get older, and I can tell this because have you ever given a kid $20? Like you give like a 6 or 7-year-old kid a $20 bill. It's life-changing, right? It's like, I've never seen such riches in my entire life. $20, like, oh, like I'm going to buy a new house. I'm gonna like. They just have this idea that like this is so much. Like, imagine all of the possibilities that are locked within this little $20 bill. Like, I mean, kids will do that with like $5, right? So I mean, it's like the denomination goes like $20. Wow, that's amazing. But whenever we get to be adults and we get $20, it's like, damn, it's Caniac combo of Raising Canes, right? We lose that wonder of what potential is in the things that we've been given. Whenever we're kids and we're given that, and yes, I know it's outlandish, and no, you can't buy a mansion with $20, despite what the 5-year-old would tell you, but they have this sense that what they've been giving has potential in it. And that excites them. That, wow, look at all the possibilities in this thing that I've been given. And as we get older, we lose that sense of wonder. What if we could regain just a little bit of that? Wow. Think about what God could do with this. Think about, hey, 20 minutes a day. Like what God could do with 20 minutes. He could change my workplace. The coworkers that I work with that are far from him, he could use that 20 minutes to bring people to himself and save them for all eternity. That's amazing. It's just 20 minutes a day. That's incredible. They used to say that with every $1 that was given to international missions, 3 people internationally would get to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. With $1. Like, man, with $5, like 15 people could hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's amazing. It's not insignificant. The talent that you're like, I'm just not that great. I'm just not that skilled. I'm just not that good. That if we're like, hey, I can get better. And if I dedicated this to the Lord, maybe he would help me to grow and to expand in those ways. And he would use even those little, seemingly insignificant things, those talents that I try to hide away, maybe he could use even that to bring people to his name. If we would look at what God has given to us with the faith of a child, and instead of saying, man, can't do much, we would see the potential and think, wow, what could God do with this? And that's my encouragement to each one of us. That we would, instead of saying, what could God do with this? We would say, what could God do with this? Would you pray with me?